Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel for another episode of Ships of War, the series where I look at historic warships, the famous, the not so famous, and in some cases the downright notorious. And in addition to trying to situate them within their historical context, I look at them as they are presented within a particular game system and comparing the way they're portrayed in that game with their historical performance. I just try to gain a sense of how fairly they have been treated within said system. And today we're going to be looking at two, they are quite famous aircraft carriers, but they're not as well known as some of their other brethren in their respective navies. The two carriers, of course, as you can see, are HIJMS Junyo and USS Wasp. And I'm going to be looking at them as they appear in the game Guadalcanal, which was produced as a partnership between the Smithsonian Institute and Avalon Hill in the 1990s. So just a quick recap on what the various statistics on the counters mean, because I did cover this game in my recent videos, but it's always good to have a memory jog, as it were. So of course you've got the graphic showing a nice top-down view of both carriers. Name is fairly self-explanatory, and CV follows the US Navy's classification system for aircraft carrier. Beginning with the number on the top right, that is the ship's protection rating, and it's alphanumeric, some of these codes. So in terms of armor, A is the best and D is the worst. So A is the level of armor you find on battleships. D is the type of armor you find on destroyers or virtually unarmored ships. So a rating of 3C is not too bad for ships of this size. The number down here, bottom left, is the surface gunnery factors. Now, of course, in this era, the Second World War, if you can possibly help it, you don't want your aircraft carriers to fight a surface action. But if they have to, then that's their rating. So it's 1D for Junyo and 1D for Wasp. So they're roughly equivalent that way. As with armor, the alphanumeric coding is based on a system of A being the largest guns, the kind of weapons you'd find on ships like South Dakota or Kirishima, and D, of course, being the smallest effective naval surface weapons. Now, both ships have a dash in the second column. That is for torpedo rating, so fair enough, neither aircraft carrier carried torpedoes offensively. That's what the torpedo planes are for. This number here, the third one along, is the anti-aircraft factor. So as we can see, Junyo is slightly inferior to Wasp in that regard. And lastly, we have speed. Junyo is rated 2 and Wasp is rated a 3. So before I get into comparing these different stats and seeing how true to life they are, just a little bit of history about these two ships, because as I say, they are really, really fascinating aircraft carriers, sometimes for the wrong reasons. On the US side, we have the incredible Yorktown class, and on the Japanese side, we have the Shokaku class, and both were kind of paragons of their respective navies' design, building, and operational art when it came to carriers. These two vessels were, I'll say, somewhat less successful, but there were very good reasons for the lack of success. And I think let's start with USS Wasp, because she was the slightly older of the two carriers. And I have here some photographs. So here is USS Wasp, looking extremely handsome and brand spanking new. Now, it's easy to be rather unkind to the Wasp because she was built around the same time as the three Yorktown class ships. And in fact, her completion date sort of landed in the middle of that class's completion dates. But unlike them, she was designed to use up the remaining tonnage allowed to the US Navy by the Washington Naval Treaty. So in a sense, right from the beginning, she was badly hobbled. The US Navy had previously designed and built the small carrier Ranger, which was not a bad ship as far as these things went, but her purpose had mainly been experimental, and the lessons learned from Ranger were applied to the very successful Yorktown class. And then, of course, the United States realized they had about 14 or 15,000 tons of allowable displacement left and thought, well, we really want another carrier. Let's see if we can make an improved Ranger. And of course, Wasp was the result. So, Wasp did have some interesting and rather unique features. The one that you can't really see from this photo is that she had a slightly asymmetric hull form. And the reason for that was because her design parameters were so tight that there wasn't quite enough dispersal of buoyancy within the hull to account for the weight of her pretty considerable island superstructure. Now, just to be clear, this is not as big as the island structure that you find on Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, but it's still fairly substantial for a ship of Wasp size. So that had to be counterbalanced by a slight bulge in the hull to enable her to sort of sit properly in the water. And even then, once she was operational, it was found she didn't cope with bad weather all that well. USS Ranger had had much the same problem. But this is not to say the ship was without innovation, because she was the first ship in the US Navy, fascinatingly, to have a deck edge elevator. Now, this was quite a big thing. Deck edge elevators had been a part of naval theory for a pretty long time. As certainly they'd been talking about it for about 5 years by the time Ranger was designed. Sorry, Ranger, Wasp was designed. But she was the first vessel in the US Navy, and I think possibly the first vessel in any Navy as an aircraft carrier to implement this interesting feature. And it was a very important step forward for the US Navy, because the advantages of the deck edge elevator were that you didn't have all the complicated gubbins that this involved built into the center of your flight deck. I mean, no Navy could ever get away from it in this period. But having a deck edge option was brilliant, because it eliminated one of the major vulnerabilities of your flight deck. And it also meant that you had more hangar space. You didn't have to crowd your aircraft around two or three elevator shafts, as was the norm. And it meant that you could carry on full hangar operations while your aircraft were trundled out to the side and, brought up this way. Now, this wasn't what I would call a permanent deck edge elevator. It was designed to fold away when it was not used, and that's why you get this slightly unusual structural arrangement to it. But it was a step in the right direction, and of course it's repeated in future US carriers. And of course present-day US carriers have all their elevators are deck edge, and they all owe it to the successful implementation in USS Wasp. So if she is remembered for nothing else by way of technical advance, then that elevator is one of the things that she should be remembered for. So what about her counterpart? What about HIJMS Junyo? Now, Junyo bears some similarity rather to USS Wasp, insofar as that she was a bit of a stopgap measure, but unlike Wasp, which is a purpose-designed aircraft carrier, Junyo comes from I'll call it a slightly different stable of desperation. She was a luxury liner, one of two that were being built in Japan in the very late 30s, and which the Imperial Japanese Navy took a fancy to, because they're partly pushed by Yamamoto and other forward-thinking admirals. The Imperial Japanese Navy was quite keen on the idea that in wartime, suitable merchant ships could be pressed into service for conversion to aircraft carriers. Now, definitely not fleet carriers. I have to make that very clear. What the Japanese were thinking was auxiliary carriers, so ships that were more capable than what the Allies would call escort carriers. and probably a bit larger than the light fleet carriers, or what the US Navy would term CVLs, but nonetheless not quite at the level of fleet carriers. So what you wanted was large merchant hulls, but merchant hulls that had a decent turn of speed to them. And this vessel, which was to have begun her life as the Kashiwara Maru, was perfect because she was designed for somewhat over 20 knots, which is well below the speed of a fleet carrier, but still kind of, you can live with it if it's an auxiliary carrier. And you've got this nice capacious hull. You can see the merchant origins of the thing by the shape of the bow. And actually, although her stern is a bit difficult to make out there, take my word for it, she's got a mercantile stern to her. So Kashiwara Maru and her sister were actually ideal for the Imperial Navy's purposes. So in keeping with a pattern that had been set by the Royal Navy, the construction of the ship was heavily funded by the Imperial Japanese Navy on the understanding that if a war broke out, the Navy gets first dibs on the hull and can turn her into whatever they like. And that is how HIJMS Junyo came into being. There's nothing particularly spectacular about her as an aircraft carrier. The conversion was carried out. She was designed to do a particular job. She didn't incorporate any features that one could call novel, unlike USS Wasp. But there were some things about her that visually were quite striking. And one of them was actually her funnel. She and her sister Hio were very easily recognizable by the shape of their island superstructure, which was actually quite considerable in size for a Japanese carrier. One interesting thing about this class is that when you compare them to older Japanese carriers like Akagi and Kaga, you can tell that the Japanese had begun to realize that you really needed more command and control space for your air operations. And the superstructure you see here is way more substantial than the ones that you get on Japan's big fleet carriers. Another thing that sets her apart from those carriers is that unlike the older ones, again, Akagi and Kaga are great examples, she doesn't have the old system of the funnel gases being trunked into a large sort of outlet on, I'll say that in this case, it should be the starboard side. Instead, she has got a proper funnel, but it's been angled to try and keep the gases away from the flight deck. And you can sort of see the angle of the funnel there, but there's another photograph here that will give you a slightly better sense of just how dramatic this setup is. It also means that for recognition, it's very, very easy to pick out Hio and Junyo from the run of other Japanese carriers, even from a distance. That funnel is a giveaway. Now, they didn't have a monopoly on it. The very large late war Japanese carrier Taiho had them too. Oh, sorry, had that kind of funnel too. But it is quite easy to tell Taiho apart because she was huge. So what about wartime service? Let's have a look at how these ships fared. So I'll go back to USS Wasp. She entered service with the US Navy in 1940. And this photograph was actually taken about a year after that. So she was a very, very new aircraft carrier when the war began. There'd been enough time for the US Navy to sort of give her a bit of break in time by way of trials and get her an air group and get her worked up, if I can call it that. So she was pretty well ready to go by the time the United States entered the war. But there was a recognition in the US Navy that she was not up to the standards of their other aircraft carriers. So like USS Ranger, she was kept away from the Pacific theater at first, and her service was restricted to the Atlantic. The first thing she did by way of combat operations, although no actual fighting was involved, was covering the US occupation of Iceland when they took over from the British garrison there. Now, her aircraft were not needed, but it was a good bit of practice. Her real blooding came when she made two runs into the Mediterranean um, to carry British Spitfires to reinforce the garrison of Malta. And the reason she had to do this twice is that the first time she delivered a load of Spitfires, they were destroyed by German and Italian aircraft very shortly after arriving at the island. It was very unfortunate. They'd had to land, and the Axis aircraft turned up at the wrong time. So Wasp had to do a second journey, delivering another 47 Spitfires. Now, these remarkable trips proved the carrier's worth. You know, she was a very handy ship to have around. Um, and also, it's left posterity with some remarkable photos of British land based aircraft taking off from a US carrier, which is great. Um, so her service at Malta was very, very valuable, and she did also reinforce the home fleet from time to time when the British needed it. So that was another very, very handy turn that this carrier did us. However, by mid to late 1942, it was deemed essential that she go out to the Pacific instead, because of course the US had fought the Battle of the Coral Sea, they'd fought the Battle of Midway, and they just, at the end of August 1942, fought the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. And in fact, Wasp was very, very nearly present for Eastern Solomons, but she was far to the south and refueling when that action unfolded. And so she missed the chance to participate. But her presence was made all the more essential by the fact that the US had suffered significant carrier and aircraft losses in all these actions. And it had got to the stage where every single flight deck counted. So Wasp was involved right from the beginning with the Guadalcanal campaign. And her greatest service involved helping to cover the island and also to commit her aircraft to disrupting the various Japanese naval attempts to both take back and reinforce Japanese forces on the island. Now, she did not last long in this role, unfortunately. So, on the 15th of September, less than 2 months after she was committed to the theatre, she was with a force of US warships and had just made a course alteration to bring down some of her cap fighters and launch a new one when she was hit by a salvo of torpedoes from the Japanese submarine I-19. The hits did quite significant damage, rupturing fuel lines, damaging her water mains, and causing a partial loss of power. So these are the worst things that can happen to a carrier in these circumstances. And I'm afraid the combination made her loss inevitable. So poor USS Wasp. She she was placed in a position in terms of the damage she received where her crew had very few options for saving her. And the thing that came home to roost, the design, the deliberate design flaw because of her tonnage limitation, the serious lack of protection relative to the Yorktown class carriers, it all meant that she was much easier to damage and also much harder to save when push came to shove. So poor old Wasp was sunk on the 15th of September 1942 after an extremely short career. Now, compared to her, the Junyo lasted throughout the conflict. She had a really, really long war. She didn't really enter active service until May 1942. She was too late for the Battle of the Coral Sea. She was involved in the AL operation, which was the joint seizure of the Aleutian Islands at the same time the Japanese were prosecuting the Midway campaign. Now, she performed reasonably well up in the Aleutians, but it was a misdirection of valuable Japanese resources because she might have been more useful down at Midway, but there we go. Now, of course, the serious losses suffered by the Imperial Navy at Midway meant that she got a promotion to full fleet carrier despite her shortcomings. And she went on to serve throughout what was left of the Guadalcanal campaign. So she was there right from the beginning with her sister Hio. She participated in the battle distantly in the Battle of the Eastern Solomon. She contributed aircraft, even though she didn't really get in all that close. And she had a much more frontline role in October 1942 during the Battle of Santa Cruz, where she actually took damage, slight damage from US aircraft. And her own aircraft materially contributed to the loss of USS Hornet. Following that, she was actually torpedoed in November 1943 and had to limp home for repairs. She was put back together and contributed to the final Japanese effort at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Now, this was not the last time the Imperial Navy sortied to challenge the US Navy, but it was the last time they were able to put out something resembling a credible carrier force. And that was really its last hurrah. Now, she survived the massacre and the horrors of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. She did take some bomb damage there, but luckily the lessons of Midway had been well learned and the damage was contained, although her air group was eviscerated. She performed various other functions, got torpedoed again in December 1944 while she was serving as a transport ship. The destruction of her aircrew meant that she effectively wasn't all that good for anything else. Attempts to repair her after December 44 were too much of a drain on Japan's strained resources. And so she was effectively left as a guard ship, which is extremely optimistic. She somehow survived the incredibly destructive US naval air raids of 1945. And on examination by the US Navy after the Japanese surrender, was found to be in too poor a state to be worth repairing, and was subsequently sold for scrap after the war was over. She was scrapped in 1947. Still, for a vessel that was intended to be an ocean liner, it was remarkable, especially given the fact that she was a fairly big Japanese carrier, that she survived the war at all. So I'll give her that. So, having very briefly covered these two ships' combat careers, how well are they represented in this game? Well, I'm going to look at their survivability first, because they've both been given equivalent survivability. And of course, that covers two things: their armor protection and also, as ever, their anti-flooding defenses. Now, I appreciate this is a difficult one, because in terms of watertight compartmentalization, the USS Wasp, in theory, had it better than the Junyo. But that said, Junyo had a slightly more capacious hull and had a bit more by way of reserve buoyancy designed into her, quite a bit more than Wasp did, in fact. So in that sense, they break even, although on paper, the US damage control was probably better. In terms of armor protection, the Wasp had what the US Navy considered a completely inadequate defensive system. So her belt armor was only about half an inch of strengthened tensile steel. Now, this was never intended to be the final belt armor. The concept behind Wasp was that this layer of armor would be installed when she was completed, and a proper belt would be fitted in wartime. Unfortunately, given the urgency and operational requirements after the attack on Pearl Harbor, this armored belt was never fitted. So her side armor basically was half an inch of admittedly very high grade steel, but it was not a very comprehensive area of protection. So it wasn't a complete belt of armor along the ship's hull. It only covered the most immediate area of the engineering and machinery spaces. So in effect, odds were that if a torpedo went into the ship, as happened, it had a pretty good chance of hitting an unarmored area. And although she had a cellular double bottom, she didn't really have any decent anti-torpedo protection along the sides of the hull. Now, to make Wasp feel a bit better about herself, she did possess an armored deck. But armored deck is a relative term. Now, again, I don't mean, when we say armored deck, it tends to conjure up images of the British aircraft carriers with their armored flight decks. That wasn't actually possible on Wasp. The US Navy wasn't really keen on the idea at the time of an armored flight deck, but they were happy to consider an armored hangar deck. So that's where Wasp's protection from vertical attack was based. Effectively, the hangar deck was the strength deck. But I said armor is relative, and the deck was only 1.25 inches of plating. So most things, unfortunately, would go through that. It was more of a, I'd call it more feel-good protection, unless it was a 250-pound bomb or smaller. Now, all of that said, if Wasp wants to feel better about herself, Junyo, by virtue of being a mercantile hull, had virtually no armor protection anywhere. Some plating was added around magazines and bomb lifts, but this was of very little consequence because it was, if anything, even thinner than the plating applied to USS Wasp. And the other reason for it was the Japanese were trying very hard to increase the ship's speed when they modified her. So the last thing they wanted to do was drag her down by applying any armor. So effectively treat Junyo as an unarmored ship. Now, how does this balance out in terms of their statistics? It's very hard to say, because if both of them had lived long and happy lives and survived the war, I would have been tempted to say that Wasp, either Junyo's been beefed up too much or Wasp has been made too weak. But you can't argue with the verdict of history. I mean, admittedly, Wasp took damage that would have imperiled any US carrier in September 1942, even one of the Yorktowns. But the fact is, she did go down in response to the first and, as it turned out, last major damage she received in action. Junyo, by contrast, survives 2 torpedo attacks by the United States Navy. And both these attacks occur after the US have sorted out the problems with their dodgy torpedoes. They're replaced with the much better ones from September 1943 onwards. So Junyo eats 2 of those attacks and also somehow gets through the bomb damage of the Battle of the Philippine Sea and some minor damage during the Guadalcanal campaign. So on the face of it, remarkably, Junyo seems to have a bit of a charmed life. So in that sense, I don't know. Maybe it is fair for one of those weird things where a ship just is able to take it. Perhaps a 3C equivalent rating for both of them is fair. What about their surface rating? And in a way, this does also touch on their anti-aircraft gunnery rating. So they're equivalents in a surface battle, and they have, well, Wasp has a slightly better anti-aircraft rating. So in terms of their gun armament, Wasp had 8 of the US Navy's excellent 5-inch single mounts, and I'll just and these were quite sensibly distributed around the ship. So in keeping with US fleet carrier design, she had 4 main gun tubs for the heavy AA armament, the ones forward repeated on the other sides of port and starboard, and the ones aft. And in her case, each gun tub or gun gallery, if you like, would have mounted 2 of these 5-inch single mounts. In addition to them, she had a whole range of galleries along the side of the flight deck. And these mounted 24 0.5-inch single machine guns, or 50 caliber if you wanted in other currency. And her anti-aircraft armament was completed by 4 quadruple mounts of the notorious 1.1-inch machine gun, a decent weapon with okay stopping power, but it suffered from a slight lack of range and much more seriously a tendency to jam in action. So some people loved them, some people hated them. But whatever the merits or demerits, she had 2 of these quad mounts forward of her island and 2 aft. So actually a pretty decent defensive package for a ship her size. Junyo, by contrast, has 12 5-inch guns, so she has more 5-inch than the Wasp does. Japanese 5-inch weapons had a slightly lower muzzle velocity than their US counterparts, so in a way, it's the guns are slightly inferior. The other thing was the nature of the mounting. She had 3 mountings on each side, and all of her 5-inches were mounted in twin mounts, which is okay. It's decent stopping power, but it also means your guns are slightly restricted in terms of the number of targets they can engage. And in addition to these guns, Junyo began the war with 24 of the 25mm AA guns. These were a near equivalent to the US 20mm weapons, but they were inferior in stopping power and range. And just to make life even worse for them, they had slightly less capacious magazines. So quite an inferior gun at the end of the day. Now, as the war progressed and US air power increasingly made itself felt, Junyo's anti-aircraft armament kept receiving beef-ups. But the only thing they could really do was mount additional 25mm guns. And by the end of the war, she had quite a lot of them. Although ultimately, as surrender to the Allies, she had none, because shortly before the Japanese surrender, it was decided to remount all her weapons on land, given that, she wasn't doing much with them. So overall, I'd say in terms of surface weapons, both carriers would only really be able to use their 5-inch singles or twins in Junyo's case in a surface action. Junyo, as I say, has a slight advantage in number of gun barrels, but the Wasps are arguably better sighted around the ship. And also the flexibility that's granted by the fact that they're on single mounts maybe balances it out. That said, if it came to a very unlikely, but humour me, broadside to broadside engagement between the 2 carriers, Junyo would be able to bring 6 of her 5-inches into play against only 4 for the Wasp. So that being the case, I'm not too sure what to do with this really, because it could be very situational. If you're having to fight off destroyers with it, then maybe the US arrangement is better because you can target up to 4 ships if you're going independent fire, whereas Junyo can only target 3. But there is more firepower there despite the slight inferiority of the Japanese 5-inch. It sounds like one of those rabbit holes you could go down endlessly, and although this is quite a detailed game system, I think it's probably easiest just to agree with them. They've clearly thought about this, so I'm happy to go with that being a decent rating for both ships, 1D. And moving on to anti-aircraft stopping power, Junyo having a 3 and Wasp having a 4. I think overall it is fair. Again, the Japanese have an advantage in large caliber anti-aircraft gun barrels. They've got more of them in every category. The only area where Wasp is ahead is in the 0.5-inch, the 50 caliber machine guns. But those, I would say, would only be of really marginal value. The much greater hitting and stopping power is in her 5-inches and her 1.1 inches. Now, just before she was lost, to tip the balance even further in her favour, Wasp did have a quad 40mm Bofors installed, so that does give her a noticeable edge. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to say, in terms of raw anti-aircraft firepower, let's leave aside the fact, which I think wasn't all that well known in the 1990s when this game was designed, that the Japanese AA fire control was actually quite far behind US practice, but maybe not far enough to justify knocking that down to a 2. So I am going to go with Junyo being rated a 3 and Wasp a 4. I think that's a fair one. What about speed? So Wasp has been given a bit of an advantage there, 3 to 2. In the context of this game, that's pretty significant. So as designed, Wasp was supposed to be able to reach 29.5 knots, which is a bit unsatisfactory for a fleet carrier. Really, she should have been able to surpass 30. But again, the US Navy accepted the lower speed because they were building up to a tonnage limitation and they couldn't do anything about. So they had to make compromises in order to build the carrier. So they accepted the fact that she could go at 29.5 knots in good conditions. Now, between her awkward hull form, which did not perform all that badly, but also the lightness of her construction and various other factors, and the capacity of her engines, 29.5 knots represented the ideal. In very bad weather, as they discovered in northern European waters, Wasp would often be reduced to 25 knots. And she could do that creditably in most weathers, so it wasn't too bad. But it was a bit of a shame because her maximum speed, which it's not surprising for a vessel that's driven by only 2 shafts with turbines, her maximum speed possible was 29.5 knots. Now, Junyo was sort of the same. She could only make 25 knots absolute maximum as a warship, which was not bad considering that she had been designed as an ocean liner to make about 20, maybe 21. So she wasn't meant to be an Atlantic Ocean Greyhound. She was just meant to be a fairly standard luxury liner. So when the Japanese redesigned her as a carrier, they actually managed to work a bit more speed into her. And unlike the Wasp, throughout her career, Junyo could always make and maintain 25 knots. She did very well in that sense. A combination of decent hull form and pretty decent engines, even though they were probably the equivalent to what was in Wasp. But what makes that all the more impressive is that Junyo was a much heavier ship. So as fully loaded, she was somewhat over 28,000 tons, whereas Wasp was about 18,500 tons. So in a way, Junyo's engines had to work harder. So I think really Junyo has the right kind of speed to make it clear that she is slower than the other Japanese fleet carriers. I feel it might be rather fair to knock Wasp down a bit, just because in bad weather she would be reduced to Junyo's speed. Mind you, the other consideration is that she could reach 29.5 knots in good weather. And in pretty much every carrier battle in the Pacific, conditions were excellent for steaming. So while on paper and in certain conditions, Wasp and Junyo would break even, I think in the context of a game that's modeling battles in the Pacific in good conditions, it's fair to give Wasp that edge in speed over the poor old Junyo. So, all right, guys, you can have that. Wasp is making her 29.5 knots, and Junyo is comparatively plodding along at 25. There's only one other thing I want to cover, really, because you can't really talk about aircraft carriers without talking about their air wings. Now, of course, the air wings for this ship, I've not really talked about them because they're modeled by their aircraft counters. But in the game, in terms of numbers, they are not a million miles away from each other. I think Wasp has 1 counter more than Junyo. It might be 2, depending on the scenario. And that, I think, is a fair representation because, as designed, Wasp had a maximum capacity of 76 aircraft and Junyo had a maximum of 53. Um, by the time she was lost, the distribution of types on Wasp was 27 fighters, 37 dive bombers, and that's both her scouting and her bombing squadrons, as the US Navy grouped these things, and 12 torpedo planes. Junyo's fit out was actually remarkably similar. So her air group, at about the time Wasp was lost, because that makes for a good comparison, um, that comprised about 20 to 25 Zeros, the fighters. She had around a dozen Val dive bombers, although she carried spare fuselages to bump the number up to 15 or 16 if needs be. And she had 9 of the B5N Kate torpedo bombers. So the US at this time on Wasp was still following what was for them a fairly standard air group. The Japanese had made major changes arising from two things. One was the availability of pilots relative to aircraft, but also certain lessons that had been learned from the Battle of Midway. They knew their torpedo planes were devastatingly effective, but they also appreciated that by that stage in the war, US anti-aircraft fire would cut these aircraft to ribbons. And so consequently, they began to put more faith in their dive bombers. Hence so when Junyo first entered service, the balance of numbers between her fighters, her dive bombers, and her torpedo planes were almost equal. By late 1942, you get this much greater emphasis on fighters and dive bombers at the expense of torpedo planes. So, although I won't show them here because I realize this is running into a pretty long video already, I think the way their air wings are represented in this game are spot on as well. So on balance, although there are a few very, very minor questions and debatable points, there always are in things like this, I find. I think that Guadalcanal has modeled these two ships extremely well. I'm always glad to see them because, as I say, I find them quite fascinating ships. Not the most successful or well known in their respective navies, although, hats off to Junyo for getting through the entire conflict intact. I do feel poor old Wasp deserved better, but, it happens. Sorry, Wasp, you just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, quite literally when it came to I-19. So there we go. I hope that you guys have found this an interesting deep dive focus on two of the ships represented in Avalon Hill and the Smithsonian's Guadalcanal. If you have any comments, questions, points you'd like to raise about these two very interesting aircraft carriers, please do leave them in the comments. For those of you who have played the game, I'd love to know whether you've actually employed these ships successfully in combat. Always happy to hear people's after-action reports and war stories. So I look forward to what you guys have to say there if you wish to. But that is me done. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you very much for following the series. A huge wave and a big shout out to all my long-suffering veterans. Thank you guys so much for staying with me, and it's always great to see you on these things and to hear from you. If you're new to my channel, if this is your first video, a very big hello to you and a warm welcome. I hope you are interested enough to maybe watch some of the other items in the Ships of War series. If it's Guadalcanal that brought you to my channel, then please look at some of the other videos where I've done a bit of a review and a one-turn playthrough. Sorry, that's a bit contradictory. A one-turn example of play, I should say. Please do watch that too if you like. If it's wargaming in general, then have a meander. I hope there's other things on the channel that catch your interest. But whoever you are and wherever you're watching from, a very warm welcome and my heartiest thanks for visiting, dropping in, watching this video. And I really look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye.